Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Perhaps before we kick off, I just want to know everyone's understanding of today as World Environment Day. What are some of the overall concerns you're having as an individual, as a corporation, with respect to how your given country is managing the environment? Please maybe just drop in your quick comments. I'm just keen to hear what's the understanding of World Environment Day as we kick off. You can use the chat function on your site. Just drop in your idea, understanding of World Environment Day, as well as what are your major concerns.
Thank you. Keep those comments coming in. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Evans. Thank you, Charles. Vincent says that Environmental Day is sustainability reporting. Evans mentioned that celebrating our environment and making it more sustainable. And Charles writes that it's quantifying Scope 3 emissions. Thank you, Serena Lesepe. You mentioned that it's environmental conservation. Elizabeth, concern environmental pollution by e-waste. Thank you. Feel free to also be dropping your questions as the conversation is ongoing, and we can use the Q&A function for the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got quite a bit of comments coming through, and I think we can get started. Confirm that you can see my screen. Okay, great. So for the purposes of just making sure I can able to see the presentation, my video will go off. Otherwise, I hope that we'll be able to keep on dropping more of your questions in the chat box, and we can kick off. So mentioned, today is the 5th of June, World Environment Day. And as you know, this is a consequence of a conference held back in Stockholm back in 72, where nations met together. It's one of the first one of the earliest convening of host countries or host parties, if you like, but that's basically governments, to come together, just start thinking about the human costs of environmental degradation and how best the different nations can go about doing a course correction. So I'm really, really grateful for you guys taking time from running your businesses to be here, because that's exactly who this session is for. Business leaders, owners, managers, and those people just got a general interest in making sure that the environment is clean. My promise over the next hour or so is that by the end of the session, you will understand what a carbon footprint actually is and how it can actually also be counted. You'll be able to tell scope 1 from scope 2 from scope 3 without breaking a sweat. We tend to be a bit more practical in terms of not simply saying how you can do it, but also go to the extent of sharing which are some of the standards you're going to be using, and even some of the calculations that you are going to be potentially using in your day-to-day engagements. More importantly, you also come to understand how carbon markets work and what is the correlation between the carbon markets and that which we are trying to discuss here today. Key to note here is that whenever you're doing emissions, one has got two options: to either work towards offsetting or be part of the problems you are facing within the environment. That said, just for housekeeping purposes, please feel free to drop in your question in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we shall be able to respond to this as we move along. More importantly, this recording will be made available within our YouTube channel, and you can always be able to go over it again. And of course, the presentation slides will be shared with all attendees whom we have your email addresses. As we mentioned, we are Verst Carbon, where we consider ourselves as a pioneering carbon offset project developer and carbon markets technology provider, built around one conviction that Africa holds some of the world's most abundant carbon potential, and that potential should create value here for African businesses and communities. We work across 4 areas, and you'll see all our 4 reflected in today's sessions. First, there's a carbon project development, where basically we design, support, and implement projects that avoid, reduce, or remove greenhouse gas emissions, be it from clean cooking, energy projects, or even land restoration. Secondly, we do a bit of carbon advisory work, where we provide strategic guidance to partners navigating the complexities of carbon markets, helping them optimize project outcomes and stay compliant. Thirdly is innovation and technology, where we build digital monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, what the industry simply calls DMRV, for carbon projects, be it in clean cooking, electric mobility, agriculture, forestry, and land use. Key to note here also is that we were able to support the government of Kenya through other partners, including GIZ, in building what is called Kenya's National Carbon Registry, where all carbon projects can be anchored. Last but not least is capacity building. We train stakeholders such as yourselves on how carbon markets, carbon footprints actually are quantified and how they work, which of course is exactly what we are going to be doing together today over the next hour or so. I share this not as a sales pitch, but so you know that everything you hear today comes from practice, from real projects, real registries, real buyers, and not just theory. So with introductions done, let's start at the very beginning. Before we talk about your business specifically, we need to spend a few minutes on a more basic question. Why do carbon markets exist? And in a nutshell, what are we trying to solve for? Now, I don't intend to dwell too long on the science of carbon markets, but to understand why someone is willing to pay your business for a ton of carbon, or what you need to do if you're unable to offset your emissions. Here is the situation. So humans have disrupted Earth's natural temperature balance and what we call the remaining so-called carbon budget. That is the amount we can still emit while keeping warming below 2 degrees, which tends to be shrinking fast. Those of you remember that at some point in time, we used to have what you call the Grand Revolution, where we as humans were working very hard in terms of increasing agricultural productivity, and over time, we started to mechanize the different agricultural activities. Key to note is that we then went to a stage we called the Industrial Revolution. Now, the key thing with the Industrial Revolution is that there's a lot of industrial products, economies are growing, but one thing that was always coming from these industries was something not entirely visible to the naked eye, but some sort of gases coming from these industries. Initially, it wasn't a problem. However, over time, people started to notice that things are becoming extra hot beyond the usual. Later, scientists came to start having convenings and to further appreciated that because of certain intensive human activities, including industrialization, there's emission of certain gases, which when left in the atmosphere, they tend to trap an unusually amount of heat within the ecosystem. Think of it, for example, in the case of a sauna, whereby if you go into sauna, you shut the door, you increase the temperature, it becomes exceedingly hot within the particular sauna. However, if you are to open the door, all the particular steam leaves the sauna, leaving the place unusually colder and not as warm as you expected. Same thing if you go into a farm, you go into a livestock shed, same thing. You go in, it's extra warmer compared to the outside. This is because there are certain gases within the atmosphere that are able to have the physical property of retaining the heat. Therefore, over time, what tends to happen is that we must find a way within which to either reduce or remove that which is causing these heats. Remember, with these different industrial activities, a lot of greenhouse gases are being emitted out into the atmosphere. And therefore, if we do not do a bit of course correction, then we are literally going to be living in a planet that's going to become a sauna whose temperature cannot be brought to a stop. Therefore, as a company, one has got two options. You either find ways in which in your day-to-day businesses, you are reducing or avoiding the emission of these so-called greenhouse gases. Alternatively, you find ways in which someone else can do this particular undertaking. The basis of carbon market is simply to develop a project, a climate mitigation project that is able to either reduce or avoid these so-called greenhouse gases, because that is one of the many things resulting in increase in the surface temperatures. How does a company know how much it needs to offset? Today, we're going to be looking at how do we quantify the different categories of emissions coming from a particular industry. Key to note here is that like in any market or in any ecosystem, you must have the case of the demand side and the supply side. The product at the heart of this whole market is now what you call the carbon credit market or carbon offset market, if you like. And I'll be very keen to make sure we understand what is the demand side, what is the supply side, because everything else builds on the top of one or the other. One carbon credit is simply understood to be a unit representing 1 ton of greenhouse gases that has been either been removed or reduced from the particular atmosphere. So 1 ton of greenhouse gases is equivalent to 1 carbon credit. Now on the screen, you can see on the left-hand side examples of corporations whereby the different kinds of emissions that a typical company will be emitting on its day-to-day engagements. And we'll look at what exactly is scope 1, what exactly is scope 2, and what exactly is scope 3. Key to note here again is that as a company, you will go about quantifying the amount of emissions coming from your ecosystem. And either you start slowly transitioning towards business practices or organizational practices that are reducing or removing the emissions coming from your enterprise. Now, there are particular ISO standards that are governing this, and we shall look at how we can go about organization level GHG accounting. For those companies, especially those in the global north, whereby it's a regulatory requirement that they have to offset any emissions on account of the enterprises, and are able for one reason or the other to go green, the only option then becomes the need for them to go and support a carbon offset project and purchase a ton or tons of greenhouse gases have been removed, but because you are literally purchasing greenhouse gases and it's a commodities market, we should be purchasing the so-called carbon credits. So on your left-hand side, you have seen the demand side of what influences the carbon markets, and that's what you're going to be looking at organization level GHG accounting to see how can you quantify your scope 1, 2, 3, so as you can then know how best and where can you start to negate the amount of emissions coming from your enterprise. Worst case scenario, depending on your geography or regulation, you might then be able to, they might be required to offset the emissions if you're unable to reduce. So to kick things off, we shall start off the first part, which is what we call organizational level greenhouse gas accounting. So whenever you hear me say GHG, it simply means greenhouse gas accounting. Everything we are going to be covering has to come down to the particular organization in hand. And from this point onward, if it's your business, your operations, your invoices, your numbers, records allow you to be able to quantify your organizational level accounting, and we shall go step by step to walk the journey with you. Now, when you're looking at the case of organizational level accounting, as I mentioned, it's simply the practice of quantifying and reporting the greenhouse gas emissions, or GHG, that come from your entity's operation. And just as your financial accounts follow recognized standards, so that a bank, let's say in Nairobi, or a bank in Monrovia, and an investor sitting in Portugal, or an investor sitting in Cairo, it is the same way. Carbon accounting has its own global standards, and this one is the ISO 14064 Part 1. These are very important ISO standard, and I want to take notes. I've mentioned is 14064 Part 1, where Part 1 is dealing with organization level carbon accounting. When we are looking at project level carbon accounting, which if you like is the so-called carbon projects, we are going to be dealing with ISO 14064 Part 2. And for those who will be doing the auditing, checking to make sure that everything is technically sound, they'll be dealing with ISO 14064 Part 3 and ISO 14065. But you'll get that, you'll get there in a moment. What does the standard actually help you do? Four practical things, basically. First, it defines organization boundaries, which sites, which subsidiaries, which operations count as you for reporting purposes. Secondly, it identifies your direct and indirect emissions, which, as you'll see in a moment, is where scope 1, 2, 3 come from. Thirdly, it sets the baselines, because you can't claim a reduction without a starting point. And lastly, or fourthly, it improves the transparency of your climate disclosures. Why should a busy business leader care about this? Now, three reasons reasons come to mind. It aligns your business with the sustainability strategies that certain customers or certain investors or stakeholders are really keen in making sure you are pursuing. It could be the net zero targets eventually becoming part of your reporting standards or requests. It also makes your greenhouse gas inventory accurate and accountable. Remember, like in any business where you're putting financial records, if you're coming to the business of scope 1, scope 3, and 3 emissions, you must ensure that data is available and is verifiable. And in this case, of course, investors, board members of the board, even some of your own customers will require you to make some of these disclosures to see how clean or how protective of the environment is your business. And crucially, it provides the foundation for any future carbon credit generation or offsetting claim. Remember, as I mentioned, if you're going to be required to offset, you must start by finding out what is the amount of emissions coming from your side. So no credible inventory, no credible carbon offset projects or carbon credits can be purchased. So that's the framework. Now let's open it up and let's meet the three most important words in the entire field, and that is the three scopes. Yeah, the three scopes that we are dealing with. If you remember, only one said from today, make it this one. Every company's greenhouse gas emissions are classified into three scopes, and once you've got them, the whole subject can be unlocked. Scope 1 is your direct emissions, yeah, from sources the organization owns or controls. The boiler in your plant the furnace, your company vehicles. And in our context, very often the diesel generators humming behind the building every time the grid lets shut down. If you burn it, it's scope 1. Scope 2 is the emissions behind the energy you purchase: electricity, steam, heating, cooling. The emissions physically happen at the power station, but they're counted in your books because you consume the energy. If you buy it as power, it's scope 2. Scope 3 is everything else, emissions that are a consequence of operations but come from sources you don't own or control. Your suppliers upstream, your products in the customer's hands downstream, transport, travel, waste, the whole value chain. One important nuance that I wanted to pick from this is that in most reporting regimes, scope 1 and 2 are mandatory, be it here in Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt. Yeah, scope 1, 2, scope 1 and 2 are mandatory to report, while scope 3 in some regimes, some demographies, is voluntary in some cases. And it's by far the hardest to monitor. And yet, as we'll see, scope 3 is usually the biggest of the three. And it's the one your customers will ask you about. So here is something to just keep you in mind, to recap. Scope 1 is what you burn. Scope 2 is what you buy as power, and scope 3 is everyone else's in your chain, upstream, downstream. Now, how do we actually put these numbers? They put the numbers for each one of these. We have to look about the measurements. There are two main ways organizations calculate the emissions. And the good news is that one of them is well within the reach of every business that is part of this conversation, or every business that has to account. The first one is what we call the direct measurement, using continuous monitoring systems, sensors that track CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide in real time as they leave the stack. This is basically like the gold standard for accuracy, and it's what large industries and facilities like power plants use. But it's somewhat costly, because you need some serious level of hardware, some serious level of maintenance, and frankly, for most businesses, it's more than you actually need. The second method is what you call activity-based calculation, using emission factors, and this is the workhorse of carbon accounting, basically. Here is how it works. You take an activity you already record. For example, it could be the liters of diesel consumed by the vehicles in your company, and you multiply it by a standard emission factor. Now, the emission factor could be in kilograms of CO2 released per liter. For example, for every liter of diesel you burn, you may see that maybe the emission factor is 23.5 kilograms per liter. So if you want to see the amount of emissions coming from a typical vehicle that your company is using, you simply take how many liters of diesel did your particular company vehicle or truck use in a particular fiscal year, and multiply that by the emission factor, and you find the amount of emissions on account of a company truck and anything else. So you simply take the fuel, that is the activity data, how many liters, for example, and multiply by the emission factor. Where do you get the emission factor? Well, if you just simply go to let's say one of your search browsers, you'll simply see and just type emission factor for burning, let's say, pepper, and you'll find that there's a lot of this data that has been quantified by others before us, people sitting at the IPCC or UNFCCC. They've been able to quantify all this data, and allowing companies like yourselves to focus on computing the activity data and simply using some of the default factors given by the likes of IPCC to compute the amount of emissions on account of a given activity. And how do you know how many liters of diesel or petrol that your company vehicles have been using a particular year? This way now you have to go to the accounting department or the procurement department, whereby the working assumption is for every consumption, there's a ledger, there's a receipt, there's an inventory, there's an accounting document that has been able to put it there to allow you to be able to know how much are you really using on a day-to-day basis. Okay. The inputs for the second method are already sitting in your filing cabinet. Let's be honest. You who are here, you know very well that every company maintains receipts of every single purchases. And that's what you call the activity data. You simply look at the different sources of emission, and then from the accounting department, from the receipts, you're able to quantify the different kinds of, let's say, fuel. So you have got your fuel invoices, you've got your electricity bills, for example, you've got your delivery logs. All these are some of the source of information you use to start computing your data. Measuring your footprint is mostly an exercise in organizing data you already pay to generate. It's nothing really new that you really have to do on a day-to-day basis. Now, before we go deeper into its scope, let's zoom out for a moment, because carbon doesn't live in isolation. It sits in a bigger framework your investors and customers are already using to judge you, and that's what you call ESG. ESG stands for the environmental, social, and governance. Three broad categories that investors, policymakers, and organizations use to evaluate a company's impact on society and the environment, and the ethics of how it's run. Now, look at what sits under each pillar. Environmental. For example, within the environmental pillar, you've got your climate change, you've got pollution, deforestation, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, waste management. Within the social pillar, you've got things like human rights, labor standards, you take care of your personnel, your employees, product safety, employee relations, for example. That is part of your reporting. And then there's governance. How is the board composed? What's the kind of executive pay? What are the policies on bribery, money laundering, things like those? ESG is basically where everything is heading towards today, if not already in some of your demographies. Everything we're discussing today, your footprints, your scope, sits squarely in the E column, environmental column, and that's the focus for today. And it happens to be the most measurable part of the entire framework. It's pretty difficult to quantify the social footprint of your organization or the corporate governance. There are methods, but for the environmental, it's one of the easiest because it's simply a case of putting together invoices to compute the respective activity data. Why does ESG performance really matter? Now, there are different reasons as to why it matters depending on which stakeholder you're looking at. For the company itself, ESG is critical because your operational and financial performance is generally affected by how these risks are managed. Energy waste is money waste. For investors, ESG performance is increasingly tied to financial benefits. It shapes who gets capital and at what costs. And for customers, we are living in the era of conscious consumerism. Buyers, both consumers and corporates, are paying real attention to the sustainability of what they purchase. Okay, it's not just a case of making sure you have the best product. The question is, how sustainable is your product? Is it taking cognizance of the environment? For example, right now there's something called the European Union deforestation regulations, which in a nutshell simply says that any food crop coming into the union must not be a consequence or a result of deforestation from wherever the crops are coming from. So are you merely producing to suit your business needs, or are you producing products in a sustainable manner? So when a bank is asking about your mission, or investor is asking a mission, or a buyer sends you a sustainability questionnaire, understands what's happening. You have been scored on E, S, and G. And carbon is the easiest place to score points because it is easy for you to really account for this. Which now raises the obvious question: what can a company actually do about it, starting in its own offices? We're going to look at some of the practical solutions that a company like yourselves here today can start just looking at some of the solutions. I'll be honest, you can have a sustainability department or you may choose not to. There are actions that every workplace can take, and ESG reporting framework actually encourage them, improving energy efficiency and switching to climate-friendly equipment and products. Let me walk through what you're seeing on your list. And as I do, I want you to mentally tick the ones you could start tomorrow or you can start immediately on Monday? And please just drop us your comments. What are some of the things you're currently seeing on your screen right now that you feel these are low-hanging fruits that come Monday morning? You can simply tell your organization, hey, these are things that you can easily do come Monday morning. So measure, analyze your greenhouse gases. Always fast, because it tells you where the rest will pay off. Improve energy efficiency. We're talking about lighting, cooling, machinery settings. Yeah. Use renewable energy where it's available to you. I'm talking about the likes of solar panels, for example. Invest in green infrastructure and equipment when replacement cycles come around. Buy the efficient option, not the cheapest sticker price, right? It's not all about it being cheap. Buy efficiency and not necessarily on price. Optimize employee travel. Fewer unnecessary trips, smart routing, for example. If you know that a number of your personnel are coming from one particular estate and your company has a provision for let's say transport, get an electric bus. Here in Nairobi, for example, there are quite a number of electric buses coming through. I know the same is happening in parts like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire. There's an entrance of solarized public transport coming through. All these are ways in which we can cut down our emissions from the transport sector. Yeah. Choose sustainable product suppliers. Your procurement is your influence. If you find that some of your suppliers are not very sustainable in their in the provision of products and services, you need to flag that. Let them know you're not happy about it, and they need to course correct. Why? Because remember about scope 3. Scope 3 is about both your upstream emission, the emissions on account of you acquiring goods and services, raw materials, etc., etc. So it's very important you also look at your suppliers. How are they? To what extent are they sustainable, or if you like, green? Reduce waste. Yeah, embrace environmentally friendly ways of working day to day. For example, we have got a lot of water dispensers in buildings. Should you have disposable plastic cups, or is the better option to have glasses, yeah, that can be easily the water glasses that can easily be washed and reused? Yeah, just think of all the small ways in which you can reduce the carbon footprint and of course your waste. And of course, raising awareness in the office. Your team can't help with what they don't understand. Yeah, you are here today, others are not here today. You can easily speak to them on some of the small things you can start to immediately effect without too much cost impact. Yeah, and of course you must have a champion. Yeah, mobilize those climate champions within the offices. Every organization has 2 or 3 people with genuine energy for this. Give them a mandate. Note that most of this save money as well as carbon. If you really think about it, there's a lot of savings of both the costs of doing business and of course the GHG emissions. Less fuel, less electricity, less waste. That's margin, and it's not charity. Yeah, it is a margin to your cost of doing business, which of course, at the end of the day, it will positively impact your bottom line. But notice also where the list begins. Measure fast. You must measure and analyze your GHG, because without measurements, you are guessing which action matters. For the next section that we're going to, we're going to go scope by scope in detail, starting with the most visible in most of the corporations within the continent, which is scope 1. And please, in case you have got any question, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be able to respond to this even as we move. So please seem to just please put down your questions in the chat, and we'll be able to respond to them. I'm seeing an interesting comment here. Carbon seems to be dominant in the market, as the name suggests. What about the other gases? Is the name carbon used as a generic term? That's a very, very important question. So maybe if I could just respond to Jacob. The thing is this. Yes, carbon seems to be, or rather CO2 seems to be the most dominant gases. But we know for a fact that there's methane, there is the sulfur fluoride, there's the nitrous oxide, there's so many greenhouse gases. Now, in most of the reporting, you'll be seeing this terminology labeled TCO2e. That is tons of CO2 equivalent. What it simply means is there could have been another gas being emitted or another gas being undergoing emissions reduction or emissions removal. But because carbon dioxide, CO2, is the gas with the most abundance, any other gas has to be reported relative to CO2. Okay? Now, how is that equivalence achieved? There's what you call global warming potential, whereby each greenhouse gas is analyzed to see the extent to which it has the ability to trap this heat relative to CO2. For example, methane over a typical, let's say, 100-year period, they say that methane is able to trap heat 28 times more compared to carbon. So it then means whenever you remove 1 ton of methane and you have to put it in equivalence to CO2e, what you then need to do is you take the 1 multiplied by 29. So for every 1 ton of methane you have removed, what you've actually removed is 29 tons of CO2e. I hope that point is very clear. So the other gases, there's the sulfur family, there's the nitrous family. All these have got what you call the global warming potential. And it can be addressed over a 20-year period or even a 100-year period. But for every ton of these other gases you remove, you have to make it equivalent to CO2. So I hope, Jacob, that one clears up the air. But in a nutshell, yes, carbon is the most abundant, but the other greenhouse gases, and we always work towards putting them in reference to CO2. But of course, we'll get into this extra detail as we proceed in today's conversation. Now, Scope 1 emissions. What you burn. Remember, Scope 1 is what you burn. Let's just ask ourselves, Let's just ask ourselves, how does your company get rid of its, let's say, paper waste? How do you, as an individual, take care of some of the waste in your own household? Yeah, the reality is either we just go and drop them in some a non-designated garbage disposal area, or for some of us, depending on how far we are from some of these recycling centers, we simply burn them. So Scope 1, what you burn. This is a scope you can see, hear, and literally smell. And the one was directly under your control. And we want to just see how can we go about identifying the different sources of Scope 1. So as we mentioned, Scope 1 emissions come from 4 primary sources. And I'd like you to identify which ones live in your business as we go through them, because this is very practical. Everything you're seeing here are things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So first, stationary combustion. Emissions from fixed equipment, burning carbon-based fuels, to generate heat, for example, boilers, furnaces, ovens, dryers. If you are in food processing, for example, hospitality or manufacturing, this is your kitchens, your kilns, your heat lines. And in original context, add the big one, the standby diesel generator. I know a number of us in our organizations, we have got a huge 20 kVA diesel generator. And I'm not saying anything bad about it, but I'm saying that's your primary source of your Scope 1 emissions whenever the grid decides to take a leave of absence, So every time the grid drops, the genset fires up. That's the stationary combustion within your books. How can we quantify? As I mentioned, it's very simple. How many liters of diesel does a generator consume per year? Take that total number of liters, multiply by the emission factor for diesel, and there you have your Scope 1 emissions on account of a diesel generator. It's as simple as that. You don't need any particular qualification. You simply need a simple formula. Activity data, which is simply total amount of diesel consumed in a given year or month or whatever your reporting period is, multiplied by the emission factor, where you get it from the IPCC website. Secondly is the mobile combustion. The internal combustion engine vehicles that your company owns, delivery trucks, the sales team pickups, the borders, the tuk-tuks, the CEO's Land Cruiser, if the company fuels it, the company owns the emissions. I will repeat, if a company is fueling any kind of motorized transport, those emissions are wholly and solely owned by that company. To be very, very clear. Okay. Thirdly, I've got what you call the fugitive emissions. We call this sometimes the sneaky factory. These are the unintentional escapes from pressurized equipments. For example, leakages from pipes, storage tanks, compressors, the refrigerant gas slowly escaping from the cooling systems. You're not burning anything, it's just leaking. And remember, from how I told you about the different kinds of gases. You've got the HF6, for example. There's a very potent refrigerant gases. So any kind of leak coming from such kind of places are also added to your scope 1 emission. You can think, for example, whenever there are, let's say you are processing oil and gas, for example, things like that, for example, yeah, those are your typical fugitive emissions. Fourthly, we have got the process emissions. Gases produced as a byproduct of the chemistry itself, yeah. You go to a cement factory, you go to the steel manufacturing industry, for example, you get to see a lot of these process emissions. So we can look at the example of the steel melting with the cement manufacturing, and just so you know, the ways in which even such heavy industries like the cement industry can reduce the CO2. What you call CO2, the captive use of the CO2, you capture the CO2 is as a consequence of the cement production process, and you reuse it for the next batch of cement. So over time, you're emitting, yes, but you are recycling the CO2 coming out. Yeah, there's so many ways in which we can look at how we can cut this down, and it's just a question of what's your kind of industry and where can we start cutting down some of these emissions. For most businesses here, I'm sure the first two options, that is generators and vehicles, that's where most of you are sitting, which is actually good news because both of these are measurable from fuel records, and measuring them is exactly what the next slides will be showing you. But more importantly, both of these two are things that we can easily have a mitigation activity for. Now, I'll want to be very real quick because I've been talking about this for a bit. So the standard approach is the fuel-based emission factor method. Yeah, the formula, and please feel free to take screenshots, but of course we'll be sharing this webinar recording plus the slides. The formula, as I mentioned, emissions equals fuel consumption multiplied by an emission factor. So let's say a business used 10,000 liters of diesel last year across generator and the delivery vehicles. Yeah, you're in the business of, let's say, baking. So you have a generator one, and let's say you've got the diesel powered truck for your deliveries. Huh? The emission factor is, in this case, you're giving it 2.68 kilograms of CO2 per liter used. So if you use 10,000 of these liters, you simply take the 10,000 multiplied by 2.68, you get to 6,800 kilograms of CO2. Yeah, CO2e. But because you want to put everything as tons, you then simply divide it by 1,000. So you have got 26.8 tons of CO2e. That is it. That is your scope 1 calculation if that is your only source of scope 1 emissions for your business. Yeah. So if you can read your fuel records and simply go and get a calculator or something, you can produce this number for your own businesses come Monday morning. No qualifications required. It's simply you getting the data, aggregate the data, multiply by the respective emission factors. Now, for completeness, there are two heavier duty methods. Yeah, the mass balance approach is used in industries like the cement, steel, and the chemicals industry. It tracks the carbon going into a production process and the carbon going out. And of course, here you're using sophisticated monetary reporting tools to ensure this. So, so it all just depends with the. It's not merely about the fuel. Depending on your industry, there could be other kinds of emissions, so you have to have other kinds of specialized tools to be able to know and do this quantification. We also have what you call the direct measurement with continuous monitoring systems. You know, in the case of having real-time sensors for CO2, methane, and even the nitrous oxide family. It's very accurate. I'll tell you, there's such kind of sensors that can tell you which gases are being emitted. But unfortunately, some of those sensors are a bit expensive, yeah. And but I know that some of the heavy plants within Kenya or even in the region, I know they have some of the sensors for them to just keep track of their emission. But please don't let the cost intimidate you. For the vast majority of businesses that I know are in this call here today, some of these basic things like fuel records, are something you can easily acquire and can easily now go towards doing a scope 1, 2, 3 emission. So if you can identify it, we can measure it. Yeah. The next thing we now have to ask ourselves is, how do we shrink it? Yeah. How do we then reduce our scope 1 emissions within the different companies? Again, remember, they're just examples. It all depends with what it is exactly that you're doing. Having known your scope 1 emission, let's have some examples of how you can reduce your scope 1 emission. You can look at the case of fuel switching, transitioning to low carbon alternative like biogas. For example, you know very well that biodigesters produce biogas, which can be used for heating and lighting. Yeah, so depending again with your location. And also, if depending again which country you're in, some of the grids are very clean, or you can just go solar, for example. Yeah. So think locally. Yeah. Think of replacing charcoal or heavy fuel oil in a process with something like biogas or LPG. Yes, LPG has emissions, but it's far less compared to something like coal or charcoal. Yeah. Or pairing the generator with solar and battery so it runs hours instead of days. Yeah. So that is something that you can also consider doing. Moving forward, we have got energy efficient improvements. Basically, we're optimizing industrial processes and equipment. Often, the cheapest turn you'll ever cut is the one you stop wasting. So, better maintenance, right-sized motors, fixed compressed air leaks. These are some of the easiest way you can enhance some of your energy efficiency areas. Electrification of fleets is, I think, it's pretty open and it's known. I know not a number of countries within the continent are looking at this. So replacing petrol or diesel vehicles with electric ones is very important. And we shall be looking at some of this later. We also have got leak detection and repair, finding and fixing fugitive methane or refrigerant leaks before they breathe money and carbon. Remember, if you leave the door to your fridge open, what happens? It takes more energy to get things cool. So if your refrigerator in the company or your air conditioners are having some leaks, you're consuming more energy trying to arrive at a desired result, but you never get there. So you're only burning more energy, burning more capital, and of course, more emissions are being emitted. Okay, so every one of these levels you're seeing here cuts your fuel and energy bills. So, and scope 1 reduction is a cost control program, yeah? So maintain your costs, control your cost, and you should be able to manage your scope 1 emissions. Please feel free to put in some of your comments, your ideas of how you can look at doing this at your company, and we'll be able to pick some of the comments and just share here. Now, having understood what we typically ban or neglect from leakage, we can look at the case of scope 2 emissions. Yeah, the emissions hiding inside your electricity bill. They don't happen on your premises. Let's be clear. If your company is getting electricity from the grid, you might be wondering, if I'm getting electricity from the grid, why is it then accounted to me? The reason is it's an indirect emission, yeah? Because we have to ask ourselves and we have to assess the extent to which the electricity coming to your company is clean, yeah? So yes, they don't happen on your premises, but they happen elsewhere, but you're using that product of electricity. So the cleaner your grid, the better you see. So, and as you'll see, where you operate and what power you buy can change the number dramatically. And I'm sure some of you have got some interesting examples of what you have been able to do as a company. Please feel free to share your thoughts. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling your organizations, and cooling the different areas within your organization. Unlike, scope 1, the combustion doesn't happen in your facility. It tends to happen at the power provider. In the case of Kenya, for example, you're looking at the Kenya Power. Luckily for a place like here in Kenya, the grid is pretty much clean, but it's not 100% clean. It's about 90% or so. So there is still an amount of electricity being generated that we have to compute and see what is your scope 2 emission on account of your electricity. So we have to acquire what you call the grid emission factor. Of course, it changes. It's different from one country to the next. Multiplied by the activity data, in this case, the amount of kilowatt hours you have consumed in a typical reporting period. Okay. Now here you can see that what you're seeing here on your screen are distinctions of scope 2 emissions. You might be worried it's not a bit technical. It's not really technical. The two ways we can measure scope 2 emission, and I've already mentioned one, for example. So what you call location based. So this simply uses the average fuel mix of the electricity grid where you're located, and the cleaner it is, the lower your number is. Yeah. So you can either go towards the hurdle of calculating the grid's average emission factor. However, again, if you go to the UNFCCC website, you'll be able to see this number for literally every country. You can have the country's grid emission factor, then you simply multiply by the amount of electricity used. That is simple. Yeah. Now, the second option is what you call the market-based approach, where it's simply reflecting the specific electricity you actually contract, the percentage mix in the power you are deliberately purchased through either your tariff or supply agreement. This number you can influence because it rewards procurement choices. Why do we provide both of these options? Because together they can tell you the different truths, where you happen to operate and what you have chosen to do about it. A business can easily move its grid, but it can often change. You can't easily move your grid, but you can often change what you are consuming, what you're buying. And in some countries, we know for a fact that there are different power producers. So it's up to you as a company to see whom do you want to be your provider of electricity. Okay. I hope we're together. Please feel free to drop any questions that you might be having on your side. Let me just quickly check and see if there are any burning comments or questions. Just a moment. Okay, so I'm seeing so are there local emission factors according to scopes available for Kenya? Yes or no, it depends for which one exactly, but most people simply tend to use default values provided by IPCC and UNFCCC. I'm also seeing a question from Florida. Our question is, for SMEs, how do they manage the sensors, trackers? Is there a guide on how SME can still be able to report on these figures, considering that banks are leaning more on providing loans to green initiatives? Okay, so like I mentioned, these sensors, these monitors are out there. But the issue with them is that they tend to be a bit pricey or costly. So you can check what's locally available, or can check what you can import from mostly the Asian market, some of these sensors. Yeah. But if there's a way in which you're able to compute, my suggestion will be, especially for scope 1, they should be pretty easy for you to compute, especially if you're an SME and you're not a heavy industry. So explore that option of being able to compute. And remember, it is pretty straightforward. You simply look at the activity data, multiply by the emission factor. And for you to go there, you must be able to, first of all, assess the sources of your emissions. I hope you're together. Let me check also in the Q&A box if there's anything coming up. So there's a question from my namesake. Yeah. I recognize that emission factors are determined by the IPCC, and for most sub-Saharan African countries, they use general emission factors, while developed countries have country-specific emission factors, correct? What is the process of coming up with the specific EFs? Can the EF be updated at a time or need basis? So if, for example, you're in Kenya and you check up EPRA, you'll be able to see how they periodically update things like the Kenya's grid emission factors. Yeah, so it's still possible for you to compute it. And of course, you have to use specific methodologies. And some of those methodologies, you'll be looking at them when you're looking at project level accounting. But for the case of organizational level accounting, grid emission factor, that one we can cover it under project level accounting, but a default methodology we use is the ISO 14064 part 1. So please keep on posting your question in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I'll be able to quickly respond to them. Now, we are now looking at a case of differentiating location-based and market-based accounting. I think this question closely resonates to the question from my namesake Charles. So the location-based approach measures your emissions using the average grid emission factor of your region. Yeah, it reflects the actual energy mix available in your area or your country, whether that's coal, hydro, wind, or solar. The example given here is a company-based we're going to look at an example. For example, a company where the grid is heavily coal dependent reports will have a higher scope 2 emission than a company, let's say, in a place like, let's say, Kenya, because there are some countries that are very heavily industrialized and use a lot of coal. For example, I know China and India, but of course they're going renewables. But compared to those countries to a place like, let's say, the countries in the Nordic part of Europe, yeah, the grid is predominantly hydropower. Yeah, so same machine, same consumption, but completely different footprint because of the geography. What does your country's grid consist of? The more renewable it is used for generating electricity, then you're likely to have a far less scope 2 emissions. So again, in the case of Kenya, I know Kenya's grid is very, very well in terms of clean compared to the most of the continent. So you'll be expecting your scope 2 emissions to be far less for the same activity done, let's say, in far south or far west, for example, not mentioning any country's name. I think you get the point. So businesses operating on grids with a higher share of renewables, for example, Kenya, which is very rich in geothermal, hydro, and wind, okay, carry a naturally lighter location-based scope 2. That is a genuine competitive story. You can tell the typical international buyer and tell them, hey, products made here in Kenya are made on cleaner energy or cleaner power. Meanwhile, businesses on heavier coal-leaning grids elsewhere on the continent carry a bigger number through no fault of their own, but because they are using the grid that is not entirely clean, then they have to bear the consequence, which is where now the second method comes in, the market-based approach. The market-based approach uses a supply-specific emission factor reflecting your contractual energy purchases. Yeah, it applies when the organizations use power purchase agreements, renewable energy certificates, or guarantees of origin. Yeah, something like renewable energy certificates. I know, for example, that a number of countries, the continents are keen to do this, and basically it simply means it represents 1 megawatt hour of energy used that is classified as renewable. Yeah, so some of the things we can use from a market-based approach. Now, I can use the example of, as you can see, the example of a company in Germany buying 100% renewable PPAs reports far lower scope 2 than a neighbor on the standard grid because this particular company is buying specifically from, let's say, solar or wind. So their reporting becomes very different, even though they might be doing the same line of business. Okay. So here the strategic takeaway is that location is your starting hand. The market-based approach is how you can pay it. And of course, how much all this depends on what kind of business you run. So we now have to look at what are some of the scope 2, the sources of scope 2 emissions. Yeah, the carbon intensity of electricity use differs enormously by industry. And we are going to look at how you place your own business within this different spectrum, which in turn predicts where your savings will come from. So on the high end, you can see that the 3 sectors, you've got data centers with the heavy energy consumption for server cooling and computing, where every digital service you use runs on a serious amount of power. And I know that, for example, you guys know that there's been conversations about having data centers in the continent. The question is the amount of energy required to maintain them, the emissions. Is it a better use of our time and money compared to energy for people to use for the day-to-day activities, for example? Yeah, so that's something for you to think about. Manufacturing plants with the largest demand for machinery, production lines. And remember, even if a government is giving you certain preferential tariffs, it does not negate the fact that they are still emissions. Yeah. So tariffs, emissions, they have nothing to do with each other. The key thing is a government can make it very cheap for you to buy the electricity, but emissions are emissions. If the source of the electricity is not as renewable as possible, the emissions are still too high. So if you run motors, compressors, or cold storage, you know the story. Yeah. And retail chains, commercial buildings where heating, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, lighting, they are the key source of the bills there. Just go into any of these big supermarkets or shopping malls. Lights are running throughout. I know some, for example, in Nairobi, like Two Rivers Mall, they've been doing quite a bit on the solar to try and displace some from the grid. But the reality is that a lot of these kinds of buildings, they need a lot of heating, lighting, air conditioners. And if all of this is coming from the grid, you best hope that your grid is very clean. Otherwise, you're picking up a lot of scope 2 emissions, not under your own deed, but because of whoever is the provider. And of course, on the lower end, that the financial services and the IT companies, office-based operations, that importantly can transition to renewable relatively easily. Yeah, some of these companies can easily use solar energy. The kind of energy they require is not too intense or too heavy, and so they can easily transition. We often encourage public administration buildings, institutions of higher learning to consider renewables because the energy demand might not be as high and as intensive as other industries. Now, here's how to use this particular information. If you're in the high group that is on your left side, your scope 2 is probably one of your biggest emission lines, and of course energy and of course efficiency investment. So better cooling, better motors, better building management will move this particular needle very fast. If you're in the lower group that is on your right hand side, your absolute number is smaller, but your ability to act is greater. Switching what you buy can take you most of this particular way. Either way, I'm sure either one of you has got, you fall in either one of the two spectrum. And for us, it's really to see how specifically can you as a company, SME or large scale, how can you go about reducing the scope 2 emission? And of course, some of these things are things that you have actually been able to implement within your own homes actually. So organization can cut scope 2 emissions through two main ways, and that is families of action that use less and source cleaner. So family one, as you can see on your left side, is the energy efficiency measures. LED lighting and smart building systems can reduce energy use by 20 to 30%. And that's not a rounding error. That's a meaningful slice of our power bill. Yeah, just look at the typical power bill and being able to reduce it by 20 or 30%. That's a huge bill, especially if you're looking at companies. I know that sometimes LED bulbs or lighting can be a bit costlier, but if you look at it long term, they tend to help you in the numbers. HVAC optimization and smart thermostats can cut cooling related emissions by 15 to 25%, depending on the manufacturer. And in our climate, cooling is often the silent giant on our bill. We love our ACs, yeah, we love our ACs. That's the reality, but we never see the bill that is coming to finance to settle, yeah. So you can simply do a lot of energy audits with load management, identify the inefficiencies. You can see and optimize when and how you can draw your power. It's a very simple thing. Simply get an energy auditor to come study your energy consumptions to see where are you spending the most. It's a pretty simple operation. It takes within a simple day and you have gotten your energy audit. Yeah. So there'll be a small cost implication if your team does not have an energy auditor, but it's a small spend that can help you to really to be able to quantify your energy consumption. On your right side, you've got the renewable energy sourcing. Of course, here we're looking at things like solar. You know, solar is far less more affordable to deploy than wind, and yes, it's still applicable though. And also, of course, also, I know, like I mentioned, mostly geographies are getting their market opened. You can get power purchase agreements from different service providers. Yes, that's another option. The beautiful thing about Scope 2 is that climate action and cost reduction point in exactly the same direction, literally. the more the more you can cut down your spend on your electricity bills from the grid, literally it translates to lesser emissions. Yeah, it's directly correlated. That's the beauty about scope 2. You cut down your costs by going green, improving efficiencies, of course, then you're cutting down on your scope 2 emissions. It's literally a pound for pound. Yeah, every kilowatt hour saved in shillings or dollars or kwacha. Yeah, every clean kilowatt hour bought establishes your cost against fuel driven tariffs. So can this work at scale? We can look at some examples. I won't want to spend too much time. These are companies that some of you know. And of course, like I've mentioned, depending on the intervention, there'll be a cost implication on depending on which option. So I just want to let me just pick one. And of course, you all know Google, you all know Amazon, you all know Unilever, you all know Apple. They're able to do a lot of the transition. So we know, for example, Google runs 100% renewable energy purchase agreements across all of its data centers because it's very clean. It's very keen to ensure that its activities are not contributing to higher emissions on account of scope 2. And it has gone a step further. It's shifting to hourly carbon-free electricity matching so that consumption is matched to clean power hour by hour, not just average of a given year. We also know that Amazon has invested in a lot of wind and solar PPAs to power its warehouses and office. And of course, this means it's been able to reduce its scope 2 emission. The trend ever since 2018. Apple, some of you have got Apple phones. It's using 100% renewable energy across the bulk of its operation. But of course, I'm talking about scope 2, not necessarily scope 3. In this case, is for scope 2. Last but not least is Unilever. You know, most of the products coming from Unilever. They took an efficiency-first approach in its manufacturing plants and achieved 100% renewable energy across the bulk of its factories by 2021. So what you can really pick here is that the pattern every single time, measure, then improve efficiency, then buy or build clean power, then report it credibly. Okay, it's a very systematic process. You have to measure, you improve efficiency, then you can buy or build the clean power, and of course be able to report it. Yeah, none of these companies started with a moonshot. They started with an inventory. Okay, so it's very, very important. You start simple, start taking account of your measurements. Yeah. And here's why it matters to you as a company within the continent. Even if you'll never sign a $1 billion PPA, these are the companies writing supply requirements. Their commitments cascade down their value chains into the questionnaires and quota clauses arriving on your desks. Some of you have handled contracts coming from some of these companies, and there are those disclosures that ask you to do this kind of reporting and that reporting as part of the due diligence to see if you're going to get their contracts. So my point is that no company is too small to say we don't emit too much, and no company is saying we are too big to be worried about some of these efficiencies, especially if you're contributing to the national economy. No, there's no excuse. There are ways in which we can really work towards making sure we can remove or reduce our emissions, which now takes us to now the last emission, the scope emission, which is now scope 3. Yeah, it's all about the value chain, upstream, downstream. If you look at it, that scope 1 is what you burn, scope 2 is what you buy as power, scope 3 is everything else. There have been certain conversations about scope 4. I won't want to go to scope 4 emissions today. I want to focus on 1, 2, and 3. So for scope 3 is basically everyone else. And for most companies, it's where the bulk of the footprint actually lives. Okay. And as I'm going through this, I just want you to have an honest reflection. You know very well that your upstream, the products you're acquiring are coming from third-party service providers. That is something you know very well. Yeah. Yet you know that some of the service providers are not necessarily providing the kind of disclosures you need. But what then you forget is that when you come to deal with certain companies, for example, the ones you're mentioning, part of the due diligence requires that for you to declare your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. My point is this: if you're keen to ensure that you get more and more businesses from some of these heavy contractors, my suggestion to you is it's important that you start moving towards working on your emissions. And scope 3 is where you must start having honest, difficult conversations with some of your service providers. So scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions from your organization's value chain, both upstream from your suppliers and downstream from how your products and services are used and disposed of. And here's the number that should make everyone really be attentive. In many industries, scope 3 accounts for 70 to 90% of the total corporate emissions. Yeah, depending on the kind of industry you are, 70 to 90% of emissions are on account of your scope 3 emissions. And that's what I told you. I want you to have a silent, honest reflection. How do you acquire your goods and services as a company? How do you ensure your goods and services then reach your customers? If you try and factor in the amount of emissions that are getting commodities up to you and are getting your commodities to your customers, you can then see that there's a lot of emissions that one needs to really start getting serious with. Why do scope 3 emissions matter so much right now? It's very simple. They denominate the totals, as I've said, 70 to 90% is what we are seeing. And of course, they're critical for what you call the net zero commitments and what you call the science-based targets. No company can credibly claim net zero while ignoring 90% of its footprint. Let's be honest. You're a consultancy firm, very good. But you have to go across 600 kilometers and you want to use an aeroplane. That's a downstream emission that you have to account. And you have the data, you know who and when and where to your people had to fly to do a consultancy gig. So don't think scope 1, 2, 3 emission only affects manufacturers. No, even consultant gigs like ourselves as Verst Carbon, we are equally affected. Yes, so we have to do all this accounting. Yeah, and there's an increasingly influence that ESG performance and sustainability rankings, which feed into investment decision and procurement scoring, will keep on affecting you as your company is looking to scale and grow. Now, I want us to be very proactive moving forward. When a multinational sets a scope 3 target, it cannot meet the target by changing anything inside its own walls. It can only meet it by changing its suppliers. That is the honest truth. You as a company cannot directly change the emissions of your scope 3, upstream or downstream. What you can only do is change your service providers or suppliers if they're not willing to walk the journey of net zero with you. Your scope 1 and 2 are somebody else's scope 3. Okay? Your scope 1 and 2 are somebody else's scope 3. How that point is sinking in. Okay, you have been contracted by a development partner to do a consultancy 600 kilometers away from your town. Okay, and you decide to use a company vehicle. That will be a scope 1. But for that development partner who has to report their sustainability record, they have to say the scope 3 emissions on account of services rendered by you as a consultant. Our point is synced in. Your scope 1 and scope 2 become somebody else's scope 3. Okay, and therefore, because your company has the interest of making sure you keep on dealing with the company's business providers or clients, both in your country and beyond, you have to make sure you can demonstrate that your scope 1, scope 2 emissions are low, and also engage suppliers whose scope 3 is equally low. So as when you're reporting this to your investors or future clients, you are as clean as possible or heading towards net zero. I hope we're together. I want us to now take some moment to really break down scope 1 and scope 2. So sorry, the scope 3 into upstream and downstream emission. So you can make sure we really understand the differences. I know for some of you already understand. So it's just a question of now coming terms with the realities before us. Now remember, these are just examples. You best know what your business is all up to. So you best know what will be classified as your upstream emission and your downstream emission. Okay, this is just for example purposes. And I'll be so glad if guys, you could also be just putting it down, saying, or you can even ask, what are some of how do you handle emissions from this kind of business, your upstream or downstream? And we shall be picking some examples and just going over this, okay? We're all here to educate one another and to see how can we, as corporations within the continent, go green, the best of ability. On your left-hand side is upstream. Everything that happens before the product or service reaches you. Purchase goods and services. The emissions baked into the materials, products and services you buy. For a manufacturer, it could be the raw materials. For a hotel, it could be food and supplies. Capital goods, yeah? The embedded emissions in buildings, machineries, and infrastructure you purchase, yeah? Employees commuting and business travel. How your people move can also be accounted here. Transportation, logistics, third-party shipping, air freight, tracking, the goods moving on someone else's trucks on your behalf. You're importing commodities from the Far East or the Far West, you're picking up those emissions as a Scope 3 emission. And it can easily be identified because if someone is doing an audit of your accounts, they'll see, oh, you shipped in this and that from Shanghai, you shipped in this and that from London. You're picking up upstream emissions. Simple as that. There's no way to hide it because all those can easily be traced from your receipts, your invoices, and payments, etc., etc. On the right-hand side is the downstream. Everything after the products or service leaves you and your company. The products first, yeah? The emissions created when the customers use what you sold them, fuel burned in vehicles, electricity drawn by appliances. You also have the product disposal and waste. You're talking about emissions from the landfill, incineration, recycling at the end of life. Yeah. You are selling phones. You are selling phones. Where did you get the phones from? Let's say it's Samsung, Far East Asia, and they came to your capital. Let's say your capital is Dar es Salaam, but then you need to send them as far as Dodoma or Arusha to sell them. So you have got your upstream and downstream emissions. I think that is very clear. Yeah. All of those are how we still compute, and there's no hiding. Again, there is no hiding. Once you tell me as an auditor, you tell me what's the line of business, and you tell me where you get your products and services and where you sell them, I will just tell you all your upstream emissions are this ones, your downstream emissions are this one, your scope ones are this one, scope two are this one, and if you give me access to your invoices and receipts, that's where now I'll put the final nail to your coffin. It is very easy for you to be able to identify your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. It's easy for you to identify, and it's easy for you to start working towards reducing them. Okay? Now, I know all these categories, depending on the kind of business you're doing, can feel paralyzing. So this is my practical advice. Don't try to boil the ocean. Yeah, it's not going to happen. For almost every businesses, 2 or 3 categories of these different sections obviously dominate. A trading company, for example, purchase goods and logistics. A manufacturer, we're looking at the case of raw materials. If you're a bank, you're looking at the investments. So identify your big 2 or big 3 and start your data collection from that point. Again, I want to insist. One might say, oh, this needs environmental auditor. Yeah, maybe. But these are things that you as an officer of your company already know what you're doing. And now that you know what scope 1 is, what scope 2 is, and what scope 3 is, things become very simple. So I hope you're not getting intimidated with the amount of work. That's what I've said. Just start with the two or three big things that you do, and then start your computation. Okay. I'm using this example because it's public available information, so I know I'm not worried on any legal outcome. Yeah. So at some point, Apple discovered that 72% of its emissions come from product life cycles and supply chain. with significant downstream emission from customers using its devices. I know, for example, when you're tired of your iPhone, you sell it, but it comes to a point that phone will be resold to an extent it becomes useless, and somebody simply throws it away. That's where what you talk about the emissions on the end of life. So what does Apple do? Apple decided to partner with suppliers to use renewable energy and cutting supply emissions by about 30%. That's what they did. Microsoft, they introduced internal carbon pricing to push down supply emissions. Yeah, the simple telling a supplier, hey, if you're going to be supplying us these goods and this is the kind of emissions, there'll be a price to you doing business with us. So reduce your emissions. And this is how the vast majority of the regulations within the European Union work. Yeah, you're told you're given a cap, and if you're not able to, if you go beyond the cap, you're given the option to offset, failure to which a carbon tax is given to you per every ton of CO2 you have not been able to meet. That's how most of the regulatory frameworks happen within the global north. So my point is that one has to just sit down and see what your sources of emissions, measure it out, and start working towards those reductions. And if you do your work right, you will notice that you are as you are reducing the emissions, the cost, your OPEX, your operational cost of doing business, is potentially going to also reduce. So one of the key things you notice within every lever is that each one of these reaches outside the company's own walls and changes the supplier's behavior. If you see your scope 3 is high because of the suppliers you have those difficult conversations. Because at one point in time, depending on which country you're coming from, it's going to come and bite you. For example, in South Africa, now they've been having what you call a carbon tax for the longest time ever. Because companies are emitting and told, hey, you have to reduce your emissions. And if you don't, you're going to pay something in return. Yeah, so I don't know where you're coming from, but my point is it's important if you start now. So as in the event that regulations change in the future, you are still well accounted for. So my message to you here is double edged. If you supply into chains like this directly or 2 tiers removed, these requirements are traveling towards you. But equally, the supplier who can already answer, already measure, already improve becomes the easy choice. Preparedness is a sales weapon. Start doing the transitioning and see what you can do. I will be unfair to paint a rosy picture of calculation without giving you some of the realities that comes with the monitoring and reporting scope 3. Yeah, I have to be very honest, yeah? Because pretending this is simple helps no one. Unlike scope 1 and 2, scope 3 emissions span multiple organizations and data sources, which makes them generally difficult to quantify, verify, and reduce. Okay, so there are some challenges, there's some ways in which we can still overcome the challenge, but the reality is because scope 3 is dealing with a lot of your suppliers and service providers, getting this accurately done is not going to be easy. But it's something that you can start by identifying your suppliers and finding out how they do business, and that will be the safest place to start. I'll give an example of the clean cooking industry, the Clean Cooking project. We used to simply say, hey, we're deploying cook stalls to reduce the emissions coming from kitchens. But the industry then said, hey, that is true and fair that you are able to reduce the emissions in kitchens, but there are what you call embodied emissions in the manufacturing of that stove. So they have to be accounted when you're calculating the carbon credits generated from a clean cooking carbon project. But then a concern came and said, hey, it might be difficult for, let's say, a company that is not manufacturing, but it's a distributor, but it's gotten the rights of the carbon to know the amount of emissions, the embodied emissions in a cook stove, let's say manufactured in Taiwan. So what the industry then said is we are going to have a default factor of a specific amount of emissions per kilogram or rather per device of a particular nature being distributed. So if you don't know, use this default. And in most cases, the default value given is higher than what was most likely going to have been issued. So there are ways to work around it. It depends from one industry to the next. So data gaps and inconsistencies. Many suppliers simply don't have emissions reporting systems yet. That's the reality. If your supplier has never measured, the data you need from them then will not exist. That is the reality. Do you help them to measure? I don't know. Yeah, this is something you can consider. But again, it's going to affect your ESG reporting. That is the reality. Secondly, double counting risk is possible. Yeah, the same emissions can be claimed by multiple entities along one supply chain, and untangling who reports what does require a lot of discipline, because obviously the person supplying, let's say, lunch to your fourth floor office might be the same person supplying lunch to another organization in the sixth floor in the same building. But they used one car, they didn't use two cars to supply the food to your office. So how do you make sure you don't do double counting? So that's some of the challenges that one has. And of course, you can talk about aggregating, liaising with those people in the same office building to see how you can split the emissions. That's one option. Thirdly, we are dealing with very complex supply chains. Yeah, multi-tier supply networks make the collection generally hard. You might know your supplier, but do you know your supplier's supplier? Do you know how the person who brings food to your fourth floor office in that building, where they got their maize and beans from? Yeah, so that's why scope 3 is a bit challenging, but you can always start somewhere by at least identifying some of these areas. And of course, lastly, is the lack of standardization. Yeah, depending on geography, there could be different reporting frameworks, but I know that most geographies, especially regulations, are trying to have standardized ways of reporting so as things can be simple. Yeah. There's an example given there. I think you're all familiar with the global retailer, that is Walmart, who must track the emissions across thousands and thousands of suppliers, logistical partners, and disposable processes. Yeah, it's highly complex, even with enormous resources. But here the reassurance. I want to pair with the honesty. Nobody, no buyer, no bank, no standard expects perfection on scope 3. What the reward is credible effort, a sensible estimate, honest assumptions, and data quality that improves year on year. No one expects to be perfect in your scope 3 account. That is the reality. You don't know your supplier, and the supplier to your supplier. But what people are looking at is the level of effort you went into trying to document this. So starting imperfectly beats not starting at all. Start somewhere. Don't say, it's too complex, I can't do it. Okay, you must start somewhere. Now, I will then look at the quick ways of doing this accounting. It's more or less the same approach you've been using. So the one I've given, the one example is what you call the on your right, the industry average emission factors, the second data approach. That is, you take your spend or activity data, how much you purchased, how far goods travel, and apply default emission factors based on industry averages. Like I mentioned, the organizations have done a lot of this data. And if you simply go into the ESG reporting platform, you say the kind of industry you're in, location, etc. It gives you some typical numbers. So it's averages, yeah. It's a start, it's a start for your calculation. So it's easier to apply and quick to deploy, though less precise for complex supply chains because it treats every supplier in a category as an average. Yeah, your efficient supplier and your wasteful one will be looking identical. That is the reality. The other one is the supplier-specific data approach, primary data collection. Here you use actual emissions from your suppliers, logistics providers, and end users. It's far more accurate. It reflects reality, not averages, but it requires deep supply chain collaboration. You're asking partners to measure and share, and therein will lie a problem. So a practical approach I can suggest, or a practical playbook I can recommend is in year one, use industry averages across the board to build your first scope 3 estimate. Its real job isn't precision, it's revealing your hotspots, the 2 or 3 categories and handful of suppliers that dominate your number. Then from year 2 onwards, to start pursuing primary data only from those few suppliers that matter the most. Yeah, remember I've said year 1, you'll be using industry averages, the option on your right. Okay, to build your first round or your first draft scope 3 emission. Then from that one, you'll be able to see, okay, these 2-3 suppliers are my most important or most significant. Then from year 2, start to work with those 2 or 3 heavy suppliers and start working out this number gradually. That will be my recommendation. Okay, so from year 2 onwards, you pursue primary data only from those few suppliers that matter the most, and that's where accuracy pays. Everywhere else, averages are fine. So this then raises an interesting question. How do you actually get suppliers to engage and improve rather than tolerate your questionnaires? Yeah. So how do you go about it? It's a difficult question. I mean, no one wants to expose their scenario. So the thing is this. So since scope 3 emissions extend beyond your control, reducing them must be a collaboration exercise. That is the reality. I think by now this is becoming apparent. By now, I think you already know from your business line who are your number 2, 3 key people that can help you in your scope 3 emissions. So strategy 1, supply engagement and incentives. Engage your vendors. Engage your vendors to use renewable energy, and notice the word incentivize. Incentivize. Make it worthwhile for them. Tell them, if you do this, maybe we'll give you a 2-year supply contract and not maybe 1-year supply. Of course, you have to make sure it's as per your procurement policy. I'm just giving an example. The companies doing this well don't just demand, they reward. Yeah, because I mean, you wanted food, I brought you food. Why do you want to know where it's coming from, etc.? You have to incentivize it for me. Are you going to give me a 6-month contract to provide food for you, or is it going to be the same month-by-month contract? You have to incentivize the vendors, okay? Preferred supplier status, longer contract, joint investment, find how can you incentivize some of these people so they can walk the journey of going green with you. Second possible strategy is sustainable procurement policies. Prioritize low carbon materials and processes in your buying decision. You see, when you put a printer in every office, you are creating the propensity to people to just print, even where they don't necessarily need to print. I remember my very first internship, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago at one of the leading banks in the country. We were told in the email, always put this statement, do not print this if you don't have to. And it had to be going with every email you're sending out, because don't print something if you don't have to. But if your guys, your procurement have put a print in every office in the same floor, people will be printing. And that is the kind of emissions reduction that they're trying to avoid here. So sustainable procurement policies is one key thing you should consider. Optimize your logistics. Okay, optimize your logistics. I'll give an example. There's this huge virtual retailer here in the country and also parts of Africa. When they're delivering goods to the online buyers, to a particular area, let's say Lavington in Nairobi, they don't just receive the order and bring to you by yourself. No, they aggregate all the orders going to Lavington in Nairobi, Kenya, and then one van going around and dropping one house to the next within Lavington. Optimization of logistics. That's just an example, okay? So see how can you optimize your logistics, and of course that cuts down your scope 3 emission, and of course product design and improvements. If you're manufacturing something and can stay longer, for example, in the cook stove business, your stove should not be a stove that can only live for 2 years, so as you have the person can come and buy your product again. That is that is being shameless. Yeah, make sure your product has a better product design, a longer lifespan. Therefore, you're reducing the number of stoves that will be ending up in landfills for requiring to be recycled and whatnot. Okay, so most businesses in this room, I'm sure, here in this particular engagement are someone else's supply chain. That's just the reality. Yeah, it's circular economy, as they call it in the context of business. You are doing a business by relying on somebody else. Literally in this call right now, being the supplier who's easy to engage on this, who has data, who has response, who is improving. you must work together with your service providers and your suppliers to make sure you can start doing the transitions one step at a time. I hope things are sinking in. Okay, I hope things are sinking in. There are a number of emerging trends that people are now using to support them in the scope three accounting. And I think some of you have been hearing about this. I will not spend too much here. Because some of these things are pretty quick to capture. I know there's some AI-enabled ESG reporting tools out there that are automating data collection from suppliers and whatnot, integrating with the accounts department to make sure it can easily start quantifying some of this data that is coming in within the carbon market. We have what you call the digital monitoring reporting tools as well out there. So I think we are all together. And I hope this is a call to action for everyone to start considering. Start small. Start the scope 1, your scope 2, and then your scope. For scope 3, I know you guys are making billions of dollars out there. Yeah, start small. Identify 2-3 main suppliers, and then start working towards now getting accurate data from them. Start small. Start tomorrow. Start on Monday, as you are scaling. And as you're doing that, remember the goal is one. The goal is how can you, as an organization, achieve what you call carbon neutrality. I'm sorry, I'm bombarding you with this new term. Okay. So in this case, when you're looking at carbon neutrality, we are looking at different ISO standard. It's ISO 14068. It's relatively new. I think it's barely, it came out in 2023 or 2024. It's relatively new because guys are trying to see how can we achieve this. And you as a company within the environment here can also work towards achieving this. Now, first question is, what do we mean by carbon neutrality? I'm sure you have heard about this. And don't confuse carbon neutrality with the concept of, the concept of net zero. These are two different concepts, but they all work towards the same goal, really. They all work towards the same goal, really, and that's our intention. How can we make sure that companies are able to do businesses with near zero emissions? So carbon neutrality simply means you're balancing the greenhouse gas emissions with equivalent removals or offsets so that on the ledger, your net contribution to the atmosphere is simply zero. Now, but something you have to understand that within this particular ISO standard, it's not just a slogan. It's a disciplined 3-step process towards ensuring you are able to achieve this. Now, depending on your regulator, some of you, this might be a requirement, some of you, this might not necessarily be a requirement. So that is just the reality you'll have to be dealing with. Now, step 1, like I've always said, it's a process of GHG accounting is measure your total GHG emissions. You have to measure all of it. Across the scopes 1 to 3, we have spent the better part of this session in seeing how do we go about doing the calculation. Step 2, reduce emissions wherever possible. Genuine cuts. Okay? But now, depending again on certain factors, availability of resources, whatnot, the reality is that sometimes some things cannot be completely cut. So what then you have to do to ensure you're carbon neutral is you're now offsetting any residual emission. That is for only the portion you genuinely cannot eliminate. And you do that by using verified carbon credits. I hope you're seeing where we're now heading to. But I want us to understand one thing. Yes, I'm in the carbon markets. I develop carbon projects for a living. That is not the ultimate solution for any company in the global south or global north that they have to go to. The solution is you must measure your emissions and start cutting down, start reducing your emissions based on the different initiatives we've been speaking about where possible. Only when you've come to a point that there's certain residual emissions left, only then can you now consider offsetting by way of the purchasing of the verified carbon credits. Okay? Why does this matter to a company? Why does carbon neutrality matter to a company? Okay, it's essential groundwork for net zero goals and alignment with the Paris Agreement. Yes, remember I mentioned that guys have been meeting together to try and reduce the emissions. Secondly, it's increasingly required within the corporate ESG reporting and sustainability strategy. It makes no sense for you to say you are in an off-grid area, and therefore, because you're in an area there's no connection to the electricity grid, what you decide to do is use a diesel generator. Yet you know very well that maybe solar installations might have been far less easier to do and more cost-effective, and of course more green. Okay, so part of the ESG reporting requirements requires you to do this again, depending on where you're coming from. And of course, it builds the stakeholder confidence. Customers, investors, partners take a verified commitments more seriously than those who are not taken seriously. I hope the message is getting home, ladies and gentlemen, that start by measuring, start by reducing what you can, then consider offsetting next. Okay, so this particular standard will be providing a global recognized framework for achieving credible carbon neutrality, and the operative word is credible. Remember, credibility is all about what can be transparently verified without a lot of your interactions independently. Anyone can claim neutrality. Now, this makes that claim auditable, yeah? And it sets out a four-stage process, and we are now slowly coming into more of the work that you're doing. Of course, emissions, what is your emissions quantification? Yeah, you must quantify all the emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. I said we will not talk about scope 4 for today. We just stick with the traditional scope 1, 2, and 3. The second approach is by emission reduction targets. What are your priorities? What are you looking to reduce over the next couple of years? Then thirdly, is if you are unable to get rid of everything, basically the reduce emissions, which offsetting standards are you going to be looking at? There's the VER, there's the standard. Now you're coming to now the project level accounting area. And then there's that aspect of verification and reporting. Remember, you must involve a third party auditor to help you with this particular engagement. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, we are all together. And please, could you, if you don't mind, just without mentioning your name of company, say, and put in the chat, I pledge to consider doing the following over the next period of time or by so and so. Just identify any of the emissions, either scope 1, 2, or 3, and just say, I pledge on behalf of my organization, don't mention the organization, to consider doing the following in the next couple of months or weeks or days. Just make a non-committal commitment, if there's anything of the sort. Yeah? Just make a voluntary commitment as somebody who has taken this day here today to spend time with us and learn about emissions reduction, scope 1 to 3 on the World Environment Day. Because I know we wanted to do a lot of tree planting, which is good. I encourage that. But I think by now you understand the 2 or 3 trees have been planting, not even growing every other year, are not going to get you carbon neutral. So please just make a voluntary commitment on what is your key action points you're taking out from today's engagement. Don't tell us your company, just say, I, so and so, on behalf of my organization, I intend to do A, B, C, D. I think that is the least commitment you can do, considering that yesterday when you went to work, or today whenever you went to work, or tomorrow when you're taking out your family, you'll be using a diesel or petrol combustion engine. So you have a lot of debt to pay. The only debt I'm asking is a voluntary commitment for you to say, I intend to start doing 1, 2, 3 on ABCD over the next ABCD period of time. Just that. Make that commitment as we wind up our session here today. And I honestly hope that we are all in the right space of mind. We'll be able to share with you these slides. I've talked about the steps we need to take. It's a simple step. We have to measure, you have to start reducing, and then of course where you cannot produce everything, you have to make sure then you receive the necessary offsetting that you can undertake. So I want to stop there for today in today's presentation. We will just been focusing on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And I want to just spend 5 more minutes in now looking at the other side. Beyond you as a company looking at scope 1, 2, 3, we have agreed that it will come to a point in time whereby you cannot remove everything. Yeah, you cannot remove everything. There will be some of what you call the residual emissions. How then do you go about the residual emissions? I'll be very brief. We can always schedule another such engagement. And I think from your registrations, we have some of your emails. We can send you the next engagement where we can talk about what you're now calling about the carbon markets. Yeah. Where do you go to try and do your offsetting? Which markets are out there? I'm sure you guys have been hearing about carbon credits, carbon markets, this and that. So I'll keep it very short and simple. Thank you for those who are giving us their comment. Please remember, it's voluntary. I mean, if you feel you have got no debt to pay to Mother Nature, it is okay. It is very okay, but in the fullness of time, we will all go back there and we shall pay our dues. So please just give us your commitment. There is no legal, I'll not take anywhere. Just give us your commitment. What are you willing to do today after this particular engagement? Now, remember, we have said you measure your GHG scope 1 to 3. Step number 2 is you try and reduce the emissions depending on the kind of industry. Number 3, if you want to achieve carbon neutrality, then you have to consider offsetting. Okay, you have to consider offsetting, and this offsetting now you're coming to the realms of developing what you call the carbon projects, and basically you're coming into the realms of what you call the project level accounting. We'll plan to have a far detailed session here because there's a whole other universe we need to cover. And how do you do the project level accounting really is something similar, but we're not only using the ISO standards, we're also using other highly specialized standards. Developing a carbon project is a near 5-6-step process that can take anywhere between 9 months and 24 months, depending on the kind of project that one is engaging. And this is something that we'll be looking to discuss with you. But please keep on sharing with us your commitments as I check the Q&A and chat box for any question. And those of you who are wondering if this is something that has been there or has always been something recent, I will tell you that the carbon markets has been there for a very, very long time. There are over 2,000 carbon projects within Africa alone. In my home country here, Kenya, there are about 290 projects. E-mobility, energy projects, and these are things we are happy to get into the weed of things next time. But for now, you as people who have got a responsibility in your company, I really want to urge you, consider taking the initial steps to assess the emissions coming from your companies, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Consider seeing how you can go about reducing that, and then step 3 is if that which you can't reduce and you want to achieve carbon neutrality as part of some net zero targets you have, then consider offsetting. And in offsetting, you've got 2 options. You could either buy the so-called carbon credits, or you as a company can actually engage in carbon offset projects of any nature possible. And we as Verst Carbon, we are more than happy to support you in the thinking. But my call to action is that you really need to go and start accounting for this. Okay, please, ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking at the chat. Please make sure you're putting your commitments as we wind up. We have only about 8 minutes to go, and I think we could allow maybe some quick verbal feedback or questions. We can maybe raise your hand in the chat box. Yeah, raise your hand in the chat box and then we'll allow you to unmute and even show a video if you want to. So yes, I think we can do that in the remaining few minutes as I'm checking on any Q&A. Okay, I can see a hand up from Abraham. So Abraham, your microphone has been enabled and your camera. Please feel free to share your question or comment. You can unmute. Abraham, I've seen your hand was up. You can unmute, ask a question or share your comments. Anyone else, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll label your mic and camera as well. And yes, we will be sharing the slides, we will be sharing the recording as well. And please feel free to keep interacting and engaging with us on social media. We'll be more than happy to help you in your transition journey as either an individual, an SME, or an organization. Checking for any hand that is up or any question. I'm seeing a number of us have been making commitments. I really appreciate those commitments. Please, it is very easy to buy $1 worth of a seedling and find some empty space and plug that seedling on the ground. But the real hard work comes in first of all, asking yourself in your organization, what are our organization's emissions? That said, I want to pass it back to you, Lily. Please make sure you can keep on dropping questions, suggestions. I think if the people demand, we can go into the nitty-gritties of carbon projects development in maybe another session. But please, for me, really what will be important is for the 40 champions here today, starting to identify how do we calculate our scope 1 emission, scope 2 emissions, scope 3 emissions, then identifying how can we reduce the emissions as an organization, and then that which will be residual emission, we can consider offsetting. And offsetting that two ways, either you buy the credits or you actually do the project. So we can have a different session where we're talking about now project level accounting, carbon credits, etc. But please, we must be committed towards Mother Nature. And for us, really, it is all about how do we talk to the people today on World Environment Day. Something noble that started 1972 and has been practiced every other year on the 5th of June, because that's when the conference in Stockholm took place, and we're still having the commemoration. So I'll stop there for now. We have about 5 minutes. I'll pass back to Lily. And yes, thank you everyone for your engagement today.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I think we can take a moment to just clap for that very informative session. I know the time was not enough, and as you've rightly said, we're going to have another session just to get deep dive into the whole carbon market conversation. So be on the lookout for that. What I'd like to request the members who've joined us today is that if there's something you've picked, you can share this with your followers, mainly on LinkedIn, because we really want to create awareness about the carbon markets, about the opportunities available herein, but more importantly, for people to take personal responsibilities in protecting our planet. So that's it from us today. Thank you so much for joining us. I think, Charles, there's one very critical question. And I think when you mention carbon markets today in Kenya, one of the things that comes to mind is the cocoa story. So maybe if you can take 1 minute to close it up for us with that. And then for the rest, kindly let's be on the lookout on our social media. We're going to have a similar conversation in the next 1 or 2 weeks. We're going to share this recording on YouTube, and we're going to send you the presentation on your emails. Thank you. Charles?
Oh, yeah. So the question on DEFRA, I've just answered that DEFRA is mostly UK-based and for fuels. For Scope 3, I'll say EPRAS and IEA for Kenya's electricity grid. And yeah, so our one is clear. The question on, there's another question I'm seeing, let me see, from Cornelius. What's your take on the cocoa company leaving the Kenyan market? Of course, any company closing operations in any ecosystem is never something something nice. Of course, in every disagreement, there are two parties to it. Each side, of course, with its own explanation. But our work is Verst Carbon. We really work a lot with the different industry players, including the regulators, NEMA inclusive. Um, NEMA inclusive to help and ensure that we've got regulations that are meeting the realities and the demands of the world. But the key thing is that when it comes to carbon market, and this is something we'll speak in details, is there are two kinds of markets in carbon. There's what we call the compliance market and what we call the voluntary market. The compliance market is whereby we are looking at a case of you being required to meet certain standards set by a regulator, and then you can participate in it. So as when you are selling your commodity, which in this case is emissions reduction, it will be under a particular guiding principle. And then the other one is voluntary markets, whereby you can transact directly with any buyer and not have to do what we call corresponding adjustments in terms of for the accountable. But we'll have a session where we'll go into carbon markets. But my point is, any company looking to be participating in the compliance market, you have to be in compliance with the industry regulator or regulations, so as you don't have challenges. But over and all, any company leaving any ecosystem for whatever reason is never nice, because lives and livelihoods and climate ambitions are always going to be impacted. But we'll have another session where we'll have more in-depth discussions on the carbon markets, but rest assured, recording will be available on YouTube. And I believe all of you are signing up. You have your email addresses, so expect to have these slides shared with you as well. The only ask for us is, the only thing that will make us empowered to have another such session is come Monday, guys, please start working, calculating your emission. You've seen it's very simple math. Take this, multiply by this using a calculator, take this data from here and there, and you're okay. Yeah, so start those small steps, share your company. Otherwise, we are more than happy to have individual sessions with the different companies who might want more of our support. But let's start something. Yeah, let's have something different for World Environment Day. And thank you all once more. I think I'll stop there for now, Lily, Santeni, and hoping to hear interesting things being done by some of you from your social media account. Feel free to tag us as well. I will be more than happy to celebrate your achievements on account of this session, Asanteni.
Sorry. Thank you, Charles. We can now live at our own pressure and pleasure. Goodbye and happy World Environment Day. Bye.